Thank you for being here this morning. It is a great pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, Mark Algee-Hewitt. I've got to say, brief backdrop here, really brief. As many of you know, the digital humanities represents one of the most interesting and important areas of research in the humanities today. And the Stanford Literary Lab is where a lot of the most interesting work in the digital humanities is being done today. And Mark Algee-Hewitt is one of the associate directors of the Stanford Literary Lab. So follow the logic, right? Important work in the field, Stanford, a major place where work being done. Mark, major figure at Stanford, means Mark's involved in a lot of the most interesting work being done in the humanities today. I really think this is true. If you look at the website before, you know what I'm talking about. They've got some very interesting, very fun projects that Mark will talk to you more about. Mark is a graduate, PhD from New York University back in 2008. Spent a few years at McGill University, where he was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the Faculty of Arts, and has been at Stanford since the fall of 2012. And it really is a great pleasure to introduce and to welcome Mark Algee-Hewitt.
Thank you very much, Matt, for that, and thank you all for having me here. It's a great pleasure to sort of be able to leave our nest at Stanford and spread the word far and wide over the kinds of things we're doing there. And to do that, I mean, I have a project that I want to talk to you about and want to present to you that I'm leading at Stanford, and that represents some of the more cutting-edge things that we're doing in some senses. But at the same time, I also want to use it as an opportunity to talk about the ways in which we use the quantitative analysis aspects of digital humanities to do the kind of work that goes on in humanities departments, particularly in this case, literature departments. Because what I've discovered since becoming involved in this kind of work is that it's very different in some ways, both from what I would expect from looking at it on the outside, and also from the other kinds of scholarly models that I became accustomed to and was trained to as a graduate student in English, most notably, and what I should say up front, is its collaborative aspect. That is to say that this project that I'm going to present, the cryptic novel as it is currently titled, is the result of my intensive research, but that's built on top of a whole group of us that are interested in these questions about 18th century literary taxonomies, and I'll acknowledge them at the end, both graduate students and other core lab members. And so everything that I'm doing now wouldn't be possible without this kind of structure that the Stanford Literary Lab has made possible. And I should also note, as I've referenced, that the title of the talk has slightly morphed. When I say this is the cutting-edge research of the Stanford Literary Lab, I mean quite literally this is the cutting-edge research of the Literary Lab, in that the final few things I'm going to show you came into existence on roughly Sunday night when I presented this to the lab itself. So this is brand new stuff. All right, so the cryptic novel, Towards a Computational Taxonomy in 18th Century Literary Marketplace. This project aims to get at the question of what a novel is. And most specifically, what do we mean when we say something is an 18th century novel? This is not a question without a great degree of importance. After all, our literary histories of the 18th century depend upon what Ian Watt, as we will see, has termed the rise of the novel. That is, the differentiation of prose fiction away from other kinds of things that evolved as literature, like poetry, like drama, into a form that we recognize today as being, certainly by the Victorian period and certainly in the 20th century, the dominant form of literature as it is published and circulated widely. This project wants to probe at that, because the question of novel in the 18th century is to me, a very problematic one. That is to say, if we want to say that the novel was born into and grew out of the 18th century, How do we reconcile that with the fact that the novel, according to these histories, didn't exist before the 18th century? Was it simply born ex nihilo as a genre in and of itself that just emerged through Richardson and Fielding? Or is there an alternate kind of history of the novel? A subterranean history that deals with questions of other kinds of taxonomies. Rather than subdividing the novel into its customary subgenres, the Gothic novel, the picturesque, the silver fork, etc., what I want to probe is how the 18th century itself understood this, as we've come to understand, radically new literary form. In other words, what I'm interested in getting at is not necessarily a history of writing, but a history of writing about writing. How did 18th century publishers, authors, critics, practitioners of literature in all senses understand the kind of ways in which the field of writing was emerging? How did they understand prose fiction as it came to emerge as a dominant force within the literary marketplace? And what I wanted to suggest to you today is that in this milieu of prose fiction, the novel is not the dominant genre, but is one of many alternate forms that evolve, that trade with each other, and that, as I will come to at the end, mix with each other. And through that mixture, we see a very complicated evolutionary process whose traces are left and whose traces remain in the titling conventions of 18th century literature themselves. So through the titles of 18th century literature, we have, I want to argue, an access point to this complicated generic system from which our own critical terminologies of genre emerged. But before we can begin to get to that, we have to go through the process of the digital humanities. And what I'm going to present to you today is what I'm going to call a computationally assisted reading. That is to say, using the techniques of the lab, using quantitative analysis and what has been called humanities computing, but combining it with forms of literary criticism, I want to probe this question of sort of the secret or cryptic history of the novel. And one of the things I want to try and convince you of is that the digital humanities offer a different kind of theoretical framework to understand the questions that we're already very interested in. And they give us an axis on which to change those questions. But the research that goes into it is in many ways highly compatible with the kinds of things we're already doing. By which I mean, from the outside, what seems really, really hard about the digital humanities is the computational aspect. It's the writing the code, it's the running the code, and the coming up with cool and enjoyable visualizations. And certainly that's part of it. But from my own personal experience, in a 2-year project, that part is about a week and a half. What really takes the time is the material that goes into the project and the work on the material that comes out of it. Which is to say, on the one hand, you only can get what you put out of, what you put into a project. And by which I mean corpus assembling, as I'll talk a little bit about, is one of the bigger issues and challenges that work in the digital humanities face. How to come up with questions that are appropriate to a particular corpus, how to assemble, tag, clean, and prepare a corpus for an analysis. This is a month to year-long process that takes a lot of energy and is dependent, as I said, upon a lot of collaborative effort. On the other hand, the worst kind of digital humanities projects and presentations end with a graph. And I promise you I will not be ending with a graph today. You'll see lots of them. But a graph is never an endpoint. A graph is merely a starting point to a new set of questions. A graph demands interpretation. It demands the recognition of patterns and an understanding of how those patterns fit within the context of what we know about the corpus or the question that we are examining. So the graph is an interpretational object, and it is the strategies of the humanities, the recognition of patterns across large numbers of samples that we in the humanities are so very good at. We happen to call it poetics instead of pattern recognition, but it is still the same thing. This is a computationally assisted reading, not merely a computing of generic forms. That aside, aside. One of the most important things that we can do, of course, is frame the analysis within an appropriate question. And for me, this begins with a tracing of the critical history that has given us this idea of the novel as the monolithic form. For example, in Raymond Williams' Writing in Society, Williams refers to the novel as the dominant form between 1730 and 1750, and then again after the 1830s. What is he saying? Is he saying that the kind of text that was in the literary marketplace in the early 18th century is the exact same as that after the 1830s? So that in that gap, he leaves open there was no kind of generic evolution? This seems to me kind of problematic, and it's exactly this kind of critical oversight that I'm hoping that the sensitive techniques of the computational humanities will allow us to address. Of course, Ian Watt himself is the poster child for this question of the dominance of the novel, but what's really interesting about Watt is that he even admits that there are new kinds of genres that are emerging along with the novels. The old-fashioned romances, for example, that he references here. And his notation that the term novel was not even fully established until the end of the 18th century. What Watt is doing is recognizing that genre was messy. Genre was a very complicated thing in the 18th century, and we're left with this category of the novel that has been, in some ways, over-theorized subsequently, but still bears traces of this inherited messiness. On the other hand, Margaret Doody, in The True Story of the Novel, wants to connect all novels, by which I think she means all prose fictions, in this genetic inheritance that stretches back from the ancient world up until the 20th century, suggesting that in some ways all prose fiction is always already insipidly novelistic. In his introduction to the English novel, the sort of compendium of novelistic research, James Raven also makes reference to the messiness of the genre. But again, he breaks that down into different kinds of categories: fables, romances, biographical and autobiographical memoirs and histories, satirical tales, narratives in letters. Boundaries between these types of fiction are very problematic, and many publications do not easily fit under any one label. This is precisely the messiness that I am hoping to recover. To see if, in fact, these different kinds of labels do different work within the literary marketplace. That is, when in the complex relationship between author and publisher that characterized the creation of a new literary object, a decision was made to call a book Tom Jones, The Adventures and History of an Orphan. What does it mean that that was labeled Adventures and History? What does it mean that Robinson Crusoe was a life and adventures? What does it mean that a book is called a novel, a romance, a tale, a history, a story? Is there a differentiation between texts that we can see based on these labels? Or, as Raven suggested, is this merely an affect of the marketplace? Is just this a messy system of labeling that we can't recover? This is an interesting question because it brings to bear the question of whether or not we can apply 20th century critical taxonomies and 20th century criticism in general onto something as complex, as messy as the 18th century. As Foucault says in The Work of Writing, when he's speaking of the natural sciences, historians of biology want to write histories of biology in the 18th century. But what they don't recognize is that there was no biology in the 18th century. That is merely an attempt to project a pattern of the 20th century back in time onto a discursive situation and epistemology that didn't exist when we're seeking to find the origins of these histories. This is what I'm trying to do within this project, to trouble that desire to project our understanding of genre from a 20th and 21st century perspective back onto the history of prose fiction in general. And what I'm interrogating is what Cliff Siskin calls in The Work of Writing novelism. That is, that desire to read the novel as this monolithic category under which everything can be subsumed. And in this project, I'm also making a formalistic intervention, which is to say we already divide the novel a number of different ways. We can talk, as I've said, about Gothic novels. We can talk about picaresque novels. These are content-based approaches. Novel has always been the dominant formal category under which we've understood prose fiction. What I want to suggest to you today is that there are other formal categories that are lexically and semantically distinct from novels that have their own unique histories within the 18th century. Certainly the 18th century itself is aware of this problem of taxonomy. Henry Fielding, in the History of the Adventures of Joseph Andrews, History of Adventures of Joseph Andrews, nowhere it is referred to as a novel, dedicates an entire comic preface to trying to decide what exactly it is that he is writing, coming to the conclusion that he is writing a comic epic poem in prose. The very fact that he would take the time to think through this problem suggests that it is something that already 18th century critics were very aware of. Frances Burney makes an apology for being a novelist, but in making that apology, she links herself to the history of writing novels in letter form, a plan that both presents her publicly and economically in line with very, very successful productions such as Richardson's Clarissa, obviously. And so that there seems to be an economic and a social dimension to these labeling decisions that, again, we want to see if it plays out in the text itself. Finally, someone we'll return to a little bit later, Clara Reeve, in The Progress of Romance, dedicates an entire critical work to probing the question of genre. In her attempt to recoup the novel as something that could be publicly read and talked about, Reeve is interested in differentiating between the different kinds of writing that exists at the time. And it's this differentiation and taxonomy that I'm hoping to recover. So as I've said, the primary step in any kind of this analysis, once we've established our research questions, is coming up with a corpus that's appropriate to examine these research questions in. At the Literary Lab, we're very fortunate to have a very good library we work with, who have managed to get us full text access to the full 18th century collections online archive, which is a collection of about 220,000 published texts in the 18th century. It is very historically defined in that it begins at 1700 and ends at 1800, so God forbid we want to look at anything that comes after. But it gives us a way to probe these questions at a level of detail that we haven't been able to before. So for this project, since we are interested in looking at the relationship between what we understand to be an 18th century, or we're hoping to understand to be an 18th century taxonomic system, that is the convention of title labeling, and the texts themselves, we pulled the sample out of the echo corpus of works that we could positively identify as prose fiction, which admittedly was a very difficult process, and this labor rested a lot on the graduate students that have been involved in the larger project as we combed through the database week after week, reading the first page of all of the text to see if we could identify which ones were poems, which ones were plays, and which ones were prose, a difficult endeavor in 18th century texts. We pulled out a sample of all of the texts that had one of 8 title labels in the title, and which we could positively identify as prose fiction, and assembled a corpus removing all of the duplicate items, because many of these were republished throughout the period, based on these. Our categories are novel, since we're interested in this, romance, history, tale, story, life, adventures, and letters. These, we want to suggest, are the dominant potential taxonomic categories under which we could re-understand 18th century literature. This left us with a sample of about 2,500 texts. Far fewer than the massive database of 200,000, but still more than we could comfortably sit and read. So our first step was to actually trace the history of these title labels. And the following 4 graphs will show exactly how we managed to do that. This plot is merely a year-by-year plot of the number of titles bearing the label of novel in our sample across the 18th century. And of course, the pattern it makes is really quite remarkable. As Ian Watt has told us, the novel does indeed rise. That is, there are exponentially more things at the end of the 18th century that call themselves novels than at the beginning of the 18th century. And I should note that all these values are scaled to the number of works in the year, which means by the end of the century, a higher proportion of prose fiction that was published calls itself deliberately and knowingly a novel than in the early part of the century. Interestingly, tale also demonstrates the same pattern. Again, we see an exponential increase in the proportion of texts that are deliberately calling themselves tale. On the other hand, we can see the trajectory of history. History seems to enjoy a very high prominence in the middle of the century, but by the end appears again to be on the wane. Very similarly, letters, which we might associate with the dominant epistolary form of prose fiction, also enjoys a slightly higher percentage in the beginning of the century, but again by the end it appears to be on the wane. In fact, when we graph all of our different potential labels, we see that there are two clear patterns. On the one hand, there are those like I've shown you, novel, romance, and tale, in which there is a definite increase towards the end of the century following a very low incidence across the great majority of it. On the other hand, there are labels like history, which is by far the most frequent title label overall, but which has a very definite downward arc. So there seem to be two different kinds of histories that even this preliminary investigation has revealed. Before we move to the actual text, we also wanted to take a look at the text that exists within the titles themselves. As I'm sure many of you know, 18th century titles are delightfully interesting things that have a much greater textual field than we're accustomed to in the 20th century. So for example, the life and adventures of a young woman to which is appended a series of letters for the moral improvement of mankind, and descriptions of where she went and who she saw and the many things she learned there. So what we wanted to do was see how the language in those title fields could help us understand how these title labels were working. And to do that, we moved from the linear logic of the graph to the spatial logic of what we're calling a topology. Now, a topology is a particular kind of visualization that I've created in my collaborative work with Andrew Piper at McGill University, which projects relationships between different things, in this case words, onto a spatial representation in which proximity is an indicator of relationality. That is, the closer any two things are on this map, the more alike they are. And what do I mean by alike? This is a map of all of the significant words in the 18th century titles in our 18th century sample. Words that appear together on title pages are going to be closer together. Words that share the same other words on title pages will appear closer together. So what this map shows is how similar the language surrounding each one of these words are. And the ones that I've colored are the ones that we are interested in. Letter, tale, adventure, life is a little hard to read because it's in blue, novel, history, and story. And what you can see is that at the beginning of the century, and I should note that what we've done is broken down the century into to 3/3. This is 1700 to 1733. In this early period, things appear to be actually quite similar. There doesn't seem to be a lot of linguistic variation between any of our title indicators. And very interestingly, novel is right next to history, which is right next to story. That indicates that the language of a title that contains novel would be very, very similar to the language of a title that contains history and to story. On the very opposite side of things, you can find letter. Its distance away from novel suggests that the linguistic field in which it is embedded as a title word is quite different. Moving somewhat forward to the middle of the century, we can begin to see interestingly, that there's a great degree of separation happening between these things. Now, these individual title labels no longer quite look like each other. And very notably, novel has moved away from both story and history, which you can see is still very, very bound together. What we're beginning to witness is a story of differentiation. At least within the linguistic fields of the titles, the terms that we're interested in as being indicative of a particular kind of generic taxonomy are becoming less and less alike, or, to put it differently, are becoming more and more distinct. Finally, as we arrive at the late 18th century, that is 1767 to 1800, we can see that this distinctness has assumed a very writ large format. Now that our terms occupy almost the 4/4 of the central map, with novel hiding down again here and tail up in the corner. And what this suggests is that there is no two terms more distinct in this history of distinctiveness than novel and tale. If this indicates that genres are growing less and less like each other, well, some genres are growing less and less like each other. Again, you can see that story is bound down here as well. Then the story of, or the history of novel and tale is one of extreme differentiation. And this suggests one of the first major conclusions that we can start to derive from this investigation. That through time, there is a very strong process towards distinction. Things are becoming less and less like each other. And in that process, novel and tale represent a kind of axis along which we can read this differentiation. But of course, titles only get us so far. So, moving onwards, what we decided to do was move to the texts themselves. That is, if titles are becoming more and more distinct in their words, is this something that would be reflected within the text that these titles label? To put it a slightly different way and to make the question slightly more complex, what we really wanted to know is there a relationship between a text and the title label that it carries with it? Is a novel different than a story, not just because one is called a novel and one is called a story, but because a novel formally, semantically, and linguistically is a different kind of object than a story, or a tale, or letters, or history. And to do that, we need to be able to compare text to text. So what we did was we took all of our texts and we assembled them into their groups, that is, those that are called novels, those that are called histories, those that are called adventures. And I should note that for those that had multiple title labels, the life and adventures of whatever, we randomly took either life or adventures in accessioning that to a group. So that text would either be in life or adventures, but obviously not both. And what we did is we pulled out what are called the most distinctive words of these genres. That is, using a series of chi-squared goodness of fit tests, what we did was identify that set of words, which you see in front of you, that best distinguish these texts from each other in terms of how they're labeled. And so this is the field that we believe will do the most work in terms of aligning the text to the label that we're hoping to identify. Taking these, we did what was called a linear discriminant analysis, or a discriminant function analysis. And what this does is it asks the computer to create a statistical model based upon our known group assignments and ascertain whether or not it can use the features that we gave it, which are our most distinctive words, in order to classify the text correctly according to their label. Across the bottom, you can see the actual labels of the text. Each one of these bars is a proportion that all add up to 100%. The colors represent how much of each group was classified as which group. So the large bar in adventure corresponds to adventure. And what that means is that over 70% of our adventure texts were classified by the computer as adventures. A few were classified as histories, Very few were classified as novels, etc. Most of our histories were classified as histories. Most of our letters were classified as letters. Most of our lives were classified as lives, and so on and so forth. This is completely computational. That is, the computer took that list of words that we gave it and used it to create a model by which it achieves a remarkable 78% success rate in being able to tell the difference between adventures, histories, letters, lives, novels, romances, stories, and tales. But there is a problem. Because it was trained only on those set of texts that we gave it, what we actually wound up with was a radically overfit model. If we subsampled just some of the texts out of that, and then gave the computer a set of texts that it didn't know and tried to see if it could classify those as well as the ones that we originally gave it, we actually wound up with a slightly different result. This is the same graph, except we've cross-validated it by using a testing and a training sample. And here, we can see that the computer was much less good or much less successful at classifying those things that it didn't already know. In other words, we didn't let the computer cheat in this one. What's interesting, though, and these are expected to be much worse than our original results, what's interesting is that we still maintain a 40% success rate. If these genres, or if these texts were distributed randomly, that is, if there was no association between text and title, then what we would expect to see was a completely random distribution. Each one of these bars should be exactly 13.5% of each label. What we do have is a success rate that is over double that, which means that there still is some kind of relationship between text and title. But uncovering it is going to be a little bit messier than we hoped from the first graph. What's also very interesting about this set of classifications is the ways in which different genres experience different classification rates. For example, novels actually classified quite well. More novels were called novels by the computer than anything else. Similarly, romance. Tale also did quite well. Life, on the other hand, was equally likely to be called life, adventure, or novel. Adventure did slightly better, but it also didn't experience a particularly good classification. Most surprisingly, history, the computer was unable to classify. What these suggest is that these labels are not all equal. Novels seem to label something that we can call a novel and label it quite well. So do romances, and so do tales. Adventures and lives, on the other hand, are very difficult to tell from each other. This makes a lot of sense given the preponderance of lives and adventures. So we would actually expect to see that. Histories, interestingly, are also very difficult to understand as belonging to a particular label. So what this suggests again is that there does seem to be some kind of underlying system, but that underlying system is really, really messy. And making order out of that system has to be the next step in that project. And to begin to think about how to do this, I want to return to the topology. But this time, instead of relating words to words based on which titles that they were both included in, this relates text to text based upon which words and in what frequencies they share. So in this topology, every tile is a separate text from the first third of the century from our sample. Again, its proximity to other tiles is a function of how similar it is. And when I say how similar it is, for two texts to be similar, they have to share the same set of words from our most distinctive words, and they have to share them in the same frequencies. Digital Humanities makes a big deal about what Moretti has termed distant reading, which usually is associated with macroscopic analyses of thousands or hundreds of thousands of texts. And that is a very, very big strength of the Digital Humanities. But what this kind of graph suggests is that there's a microscopic scale on which the digital humanities is particularly successful with as well. That is, in its ability to maintain attention to each and every word, regardless of what that word is, regardless of whether it's content-bearing or functional. We can understand shared linguistic fields at a level of detail that we've never been able to ascertain before. So what these maps show, I hope, is a kind of micro and macro. That is a macro scale overview of what the texts look like in the early 18th century that we're interested in investigating, but compared to each other on an incredibly minute and detailed level. And what we see, of course, is a rather large mess. The colors correspond to our texts that are individually labeled with the generic labels we're interested in. We do seem to have a good, strong tail group. And interestingly, we have a fairly good continuous adventure group. But there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of order. If the earlier maps were correct, then, that there is kind of a differentiation happening across the 18th century, this map seems to bear it out. Well, it will bear it out if we see any kind of order emerging as we move forward in the century. And luckily, it turns out that we do. It's still a very messy kind of object, but you can see that most of the green text, which are letters, are clustered towards the western side of the map. Purple, on the other hand, which we had previously seen as nicely clustered as life, is now much more dispersed throughout the text. Romances occupy only this area here. So what we're seeing is a still complicated but gradual progression of differentiation. And when we bring that to the last century, the messiest map of all, we can actually see this in action. The most striking feature of this map is if you draw a line right along the diagonal, the vast majority of that teal blue, which of course is novel, lies in this quadrant. And the vast majority of the little pink tiles, which are tails, lie in that quadrant. If there is still a great deal of messiness to genre, what we are seeing is a kind of separation again between novel and tale. Again, that seems to be the axis along which these things are differentiating. Okay, so what? How do we take this kind of information and move to something that might be more meaningful in understanding exactly what is going on here? And this, of course, is the big work of the digital humanities and the process of this project that's still ongoing, and that is the question of interpretation. And to get at interpretation, we wanted to do this, or I wanted to do this, in a couple of ways. Before we actually dive back into the texts, I wanted to look at something that would be equally as computational, but perhaps a little more semantically meaningful. What I wanted to look at was what's called a latent Dirichlet analysis, or more commonly known, a topic model. And what a topic model does is a complex statistical algorithm based on expectation maximization that seeks to determine a set of hidden variables within texts. If we understand text as being made up of words, those words are in a particular order. And what controls that order, this process wants to say, are a set of topics. So what topic modeling calls topics are clusters of words that appear close together in particular patterns across a corpus of texts. And each text is understood as being made up of one or more, or ideally more than one, topics. And what a topic model does is give us both the groups of words that the computer algorithm thinks belong together within these clusters, and at the same time, how much of each text belongs to each individual topic. Topic modeling is not a truly unsupervised clustering. We're going to get there in a couple minutes, because you have to give it the number of topics. Because it's a fairly computationally intensive algorithm, I gave the computer the suggestion that there were 100 topics that I wanted to identify across our sample of 2,500-ish texts. And it did so. Here are a couple sample topics. Again, these are groups of words, as you read down the list, that the computer felt were similar in how they were being used throughout the text. And I mean, I admittedly, for the purposes of this presentation, have given you some that to me are incredibly exciting. Topic number 28, for example, night, castle, death. Exclaimed, chamber, horror, dreadful. I should mention there were a couple of Gothic novels included in our sample. Topic number 55 I found particularly interesting. Author, poet, book, read, genius, poetry, wit. This seems to speak to a kind of critical awareness or an understanding of writing about writing within the century. Topic number 43 seems to pertain to a certain kind of social visitation: house, gentleman, funny, friend, letter, room, company, etc. Reading these topics can be an exercise in frustration and lead you down a long rabbit hole, but what it suggests is that if topics that come from topic modeling are not contiguous with conceptual topics that we might imagine, and I don't want to claim that they are, they at least give us groupings of words that seem to make a certain kind of semantic sense that lets us get at a structure within the texts at a slightly higher level. So for example, what's really interesting is that topic 5 increases throughout the period regardless of what genre or what title label it is. Topic 28 belongs primarily, as you can imagine, to romance and also to tale. Topic number 55 belongs almost exclusively, interestingly, to novels. So by looking at the differing proportions of these topics, we can begin to understand the ways in which these texts were differentiated. To see if these topics did in fact do any work, I did a double test on them. On the left-hand side, you can see once again a discriminant function analysis using topics instead of words this time on our title labels. And again, we round up around a 38% correct rate. So if there is an underlying structure within these titles, the topics don't seem to be getting at it any better than the words. Interestingly, when I took a look, for comparison's sake, at some 20th century genre labels that are clearly content-based, anti-Jacobin books, for example, Gothic texts, our classifications were much, much better, 76%. And this makes a certain degree of sense, as these genre assignations are all a posteriori. That is, 20th century critics took a group of texts and drew a circle around it and said, aha, these are all about castles and chambers and horrible things happening to young women. But the very fact that, again, this describes something that could be better than chance, and again, chance would be a 12.5% correct rate, again suggests that there is this underlying structure that we're still not quite getting. Again, letters classifies very, very well, novel classifies well, here history classifies quite well, but adventure not at all. Tale still does as well. And again, that seems to be the axis along which this project is most interesting. The question then becomes, if the title labels that we're interested in examining aren't quite capturing the full range of the structure that organizes 18th century's understanding of genres, how can we get at what that structure actually is? And to do that, I've made one final turn to a very, very new computational technique in the digital humanities, a finite mixture analysis. This is a true form of unsupervised clustering. This analysis takes all of our topics, 100 topics. It takes all of our texts, 2,500 texts. Although in this case, this is only the last part of the century, because as we've seen, that is the best group differentiation. So this is only about 1,000 texts. And it takes those two things and it says, okay, how many different groups can I divide these texts into in a way that it continues to make sense? And it uses a likelihood score to determine what the maximum number of groups are. So in this diagram, each one of these icons is a text, and its unique color and shape indicates its belonging to a group that the computer decided was a group. So the computer decided that all of these little stars were very, very much like each other. All of these triangles were very much like each other. These much harder to see triangles were like each other. And I've identified each one of these groups. This is called a mixture model for a reason. Because what it lets us do is take a look at these computationally defined groups, the underlying cryptic structure of our set of texts, and see, okay, in each of these groups that the computer has determined, what proportion comes from each of our title labels. What, in other words, is being mixed with what? And again, what we see is a preponderance of novel in some groups, which indicates that novels are actually something distinct in and of themselves. Sometimes they are just novels, sometimes they're novels mixed with history and epistolary, which makes a lot of sense. But there seems to be a certain identity to the novel. The only other group that does the same thing is the tale. Tales also seem to be something unique in and of themselves. Sometimes mixed with life, sometimes mixed with romances, but again, there seems to be this axis of novel and tale. The story of 18th century genres is the story of differentiation, and what seems to be differentiating more than anything else are novels and tales. And what you can see, if you move back to the graph, or if you move back and forward, the tale groups are groups 9 and 7, and the novel groups are group 3 and 8. Oh, wrong way. When you take a look at this map, groups 3 and 8 are here. Here are most of our novels. Our tales, on the other hand, are hiding up here. And the position of these things on this map is not coincidental. Novels are all much closer to each other because novels are more like each other than they are like anything else. Tales are different from novels, but the dispersion of their clusters suggests that they are much different from each other. If the story is the story of the differentiation between novels and tales, novels become a tighter, more focused group, and tales, as the non-novel, become dispersed. They take on more topics and more subjects. Everything that is not a novel, in other words, becomes, over time, a tale. Tale becomes the genre of the detritus of the novel, the non-novel. As the novel emerges as the dominant genre, what's left for everything that's not a novel is a tale. When we look at it over the whole century, we see the exact same things again. Novels, very tightly clustered. Tales, not novels, but not like each other as well. And you can see that it plays out almost the same way in our groups, wherein we have very strong tale groups, very strong novel groups, but interestingly, very strong history groups as well. And that, as we've seen, is because history has that unique arc over the 18th century in which it's very, very popular at certain points, but less popular towards the end of the century. Moving back into our texts, the reason mixture modeling to me seems to be such an appropriate metaphor for what's going on here is because the understanding of genre in the 18th century was an understanding of mixture itself. As people like Johnson in The Rambler write about the emergence of prose fiction, they write not about the novel, they write about the ways in which different identifiable kinds of writing emerge, are mixed with, and differentiate themselves over time. For Johnson, everything becomes prose fiction, but everything becomes elements of other kinds of prose fiction. Similarly, for Reeve in The Progress of Romance, even as she tries to differentiate between the adventure, the Oriental tale, and the romance, these things begin to overlap and look more like each other. It should be noted, however, that the two she cites as being least like each other are the novel, which we've seen earlier in the presentation, and the tale on the other hand. Mixture and the differentiation of novel and tale. Which brings us back to Siskin's The Work of Writing, in which he suggests that an effort to recognize that all genres are mixed and that identifying the mixtures is crucial to our ability to understand how they were produced and what kinds of work they were performed. That is the key, as Siskin suggests, to understanding what's going on in the 18th century. And it is that ability that the mixture model gives us, the ability to tease apart the differentiation between these genres along the axes of topics the ability to understand the differentiation as the novel and the tale as the key transformation of genre in the 18th century, and the ability to see that what underlies all of these things is a complex evolutionary system that highlights the emergence and, most importantly, the mixture of genres. It's this that this analysis, I think, has brought to our understanding of 18th century genre in situ. As I've said, work on the project goes on. The next steps will include going back to the topic model, seeing which topics participate ideally in which mixtures of genres, and begin to tease apart that. But for a macro analysis of the 18th century, what the bringing of the computational model to our critical understanding of what's going on has given us is a nuanced and finely grained and far more detailed understanding of the complex messiness and the importance of mixture and the importance of differentiation in the history of 18th century genres. Many thanks. And I should acknowledge that, as I said, this is built on the labor of a number of people. Our three graduate students, Laura Idem, Anita Law, and Tanya Llewellyn, who are working on their own sort of splinter groups of this project. Obviously, Franco Moretti and Ryan Heuser, the other two associate directors of the lab, and Bridget Algee-Hewitt, who happens to be, as you might have guessed, my wife, who took a lot of time to explain exactly how to use mixture modeling, which is a technique they use in her computational genetics lab. And so I feel that she also deserves a citation for her patience.
We have at least a couple minutes for questions, so please,
Yeah.
any questions for Mark?
So on the mixture modeling, which is not a technique I'm totally familiar with, but it does look like it's somewhat multidimensional.
Yes.
I wonder if those graphs can be rotated
Yeah.
to look at it from a different angle to see two things that seem to appear close together, like stars in the heavens. If you were looking at them from the sides, they would actually be separated by some distance.
Absolutely, that is entirely true. What I showed you was a coordinate projection of a scatterplot matrix, in which it rotates. So when you generate the mixture model for all of the dimensions in your sample set, it generates a scatter plot that shows what it looks like rotated along those dimensions. And the ones that I chose happen to be the first two that it returned, which are usually the best, because they show the closest, it shows best the separations between groups that the computer has distinguished as different, and the collinearity between groups that the computer has distinguished close together. But certainly you can rotate it and play with it. And what always strikes me so oddly when using these kinds of machine learning and unsupervised clustering techniques is the great amount of artistry that goes in it, right? Looking at 100 different coordinate projections of the same plot to see over time or over all of those different projections what exactly gives the best view of what the numbers say is actually going on. Which is one of the reasons in my class on critical text mining I include Tufte's quantitative display or a visual display of quantitative information as one of the required texts, because thinking through how to create these interpretable objects like visualizations from numbers is, I think, one of the things that we need to pay a lot of attention to. Okay.
So a couple of friends of both of ours are doing work. I mean, you talk about you kind of begin and end with Cliff Siskind.
Mm-hmm.
The work of writing written in the mid-1990s without the benefit of any of this. Another project we both know about is Tony Gerald's work on the rise of the tale. It seems like at a certain level they intuited without doing any of these processes exactly what you're concluding.
Absolutely.
And so the question then is, to what extent then is all the computation, what's the value of all the computation other than giving credence to something people were intuiting already?
The best kind of digital humanities analysis at the present moment is the digital humanities analysis that both demonstrates something that we already thought we knew and shows us something that we didn't already know itself.
So where is Cliff wrong?
I don't know if I feel competent in saying that Cliff is wrong necessarily. Cliff is right in understanding that mixture is a key component of understanding how these genres evolved. What Cliff isn't able to do in the work of writing is get to the specific dimensions of the mixtures. Cliff doesn't, for example, make any sort of mention of the differentiation of novel and tale. Cliff doesn't mention the ways in which tales and romance are closely associated along this axis of Gothic words, whereas strangely, histories and novels become a dominant mixture in the 1770s. So what bringing this kind of computational analysis to the larger theoretical scheme that the work of writing offers is a way in which to take that larger theory and unpack it and operationalize it, to use a word that Franco Moretti is very fond of right now, within the work. In other words, part of the work of the lab, as I understand it, is to take many of the dominant theories that inform the ways in which we understand the history and the function of literature and operationalize them and say, okay, within the domain of actually looking at the texts, how can we understand this theory as doing something? And what this methodology allows us to do is actually take a theory like generic mixture that Siskin advances and say, okay, if that's true, what's being mixed with what, when, and how?
This is kind of a follow-up, actually, another version of Nick's question. You mentioned at the beginning, and I think you answered eloquently, the methodological side. What about the conceptual side, right? So yes, let's illustrate with the new methodology the conceptual questions that we've been working on. Yep. But how do the conceptual ramify with this new methodology?
At what scale? I mean, let me back up.
Let's just take on the 18th century novel, right?
Because it seems to me at two different scales this makes sense. So our understanding of the 18th century novel, by bringing this methodology to bear on it, both becomes more finely detailed and I think more, not convincing, but the actual dimensions of its convincingness I think we can see the outline of. In other words, one of the things I'd like to say, I think that this project is in the process of doing, and I mean, it's still ongoing, and the bringing of the digital results to the conceptual questions that originally motivated it is in fact the process that is still ongoing, and I won't make any claim that we've achieved. I mean, as I said, that's the process that takes the longest time, and we're still right in the middle of that. I'm still right in the middle of that. What this brings to it, though, is that ability to clarify both historical questions and theoretical questions. So, okay, generic mixing is a really important thing. What genres are more likely to be mixed with other genres? What genres are more separated from other genres? How do we understand, for example, I mean, Siskin, to use the example that Nick used, still talks, as I showed, about novelism, right? That the novel is the dominant genre of our understanding of 18th century prose fiction. Why? How did that happen? Why is it the novel and not the tale that becomes the dominant genre? And the fact that the novel coalesces and becomes more self-similar, while the tale expands and just takes in all of this other material and just diffuses itself. And I've started moving into the 19th century with this, and what happens is the tale, takes on the Oriental tale, it takes on the tales for children. It just becomes this incredibly heterogeneous mixture of stuff that becomes unrecognizable as the tale. And so what that shows is why the novel becomes the dominant genre, right? It is the one that emerges as this self-similar kind of thing that you can point to and say, aha, that's a novel. Tales are everything. This is a novel. That's why. And it's that question of why that I think this kind of methodology allows us to begin to probe.
If I understand correctly, with that mixed model is a inductive approach to computer vision. Then after the fact, you look for the labels that corresponded to the criteria that were aligned with the pre-existing genres you had in mind.
Exactly.
So my wondering is, I'm wondering, well, are you allowing this to be a lens to perhaps identify hitherto unlabeled genres, or perhaps to identify factors that might be more influential than some of the semantic values you're looking at? For example, I mean, you might discover that some of those mixes might correlate well with certain things like a feminine novel or an urban novel, or perhaps even often the novel had been republished or something. I mean, there could be other factors that you could end up identifying distinct genres or something we didn't really call genres.
And you're absolutely right, too.
genres,
And I probably
but other labels. I'm worried about us sort of reifying existing labels in a logical way.
What you've done
right
is
too,
outline
and I
the
probably
presentation
overstated
that
that,
I'm really hoping
in the
to give
presentation
in about a year.
purely
from
for
now.
rhetorical effect.
Because I think what's critical in the next step of this project
what you've done is
to take
outline
those
the
mixtures,
presentation
which, as you
that
said,
I'm
I
really hoping
identify
to
based
give
on the
in about a
proportions
year
of
from
the,
now.
of the things that I'm
Because I think
looking
what's
for.
critical in the next step of
and
this
see
project
which
is
ones
to take
actually
those
seem to
mixtures, which, as you
correspond
said,
to that. So
I
those
identify
two
based on
with
the
very
proportions
big
of
novel
the
and very
things
big
that I'm
outcome.
looking for.
And which ones don't correspond
And
to that.
see
So I'm
which
really
ones
interested
actually seem
in,
to
for
correspond
example,
to that.
something
So
that
those
shows the
two
mixture
with the
of
very
things that I
big
thought
novel and the
should
very
be
big tail
very
components.
separate,
And which
like
ones
the
don't
novel,
correspond to that.
like the
So I'm really
epistolary,
interested
like history,
in, for
right?
example,
And
something
what
that shows
does
the
that
mixture of
that-
things
that
that I
group do?
thought
And I
should
think
be
you're absolutely
very
right,
separate,
that
like the novel,
group
like the
seems to
epistolary,
outline some
like
other
history,
kind of
right? And
organizational
what does
principle.
that
And I think the
that
real
group do? And I think you're
next
absolutely
work
right
in this
that
project
that
is going
group
to be to
seems to
actually dig in and
outline
say
some
not just
other
what
kind of
title labels are
organizational
included in this group,
principle.
but what
And I think the
texts
real
are
next
included
work
in
in
this
this
group. What
project
makes the
is going to be to
texts that
actually
are
dig in and
included
say
in this
not
group
just
similar.
what title labels are
And
included
that's
in
sort
this
of the
group, but
next
what
order
texts
step. So
are
taking,
included in this group. What
instead
makes
of
the texts
the
that
the
are
title
included in
labeling
this
groups
group
that I'm interested in
similar.
investigating,
And
and
that's
doing
sort of the
things like
next
discriminant function
order
analysis and
step.
doing a
So
topic
taking
model on those,
instead of the
that group
title
as
labeling
something
groups
that
that I'm
exists
interested in
contiguously
investigating
in and of
and
itself,
doing
that
things
is
like a
taking
discriminant
that
function
as
analysis and doing a
axiomatic
topic model
and saying,
on
okay,
those,
if these are
instead
related,
taking
how are
that
they
group
related?
as something
And
that
how does
exists
understanding how are they
contiguously in and of
related
itself,
allow us
that
to
is
come up with
taking
a
that
different
as
kind of
axiomatic
principle.
and saying, okay,
Absolutely
if these
right.
are related,
And
how are
when
they
I say
related?
that
And how does
that
understanding
finding
how are they
feature analysis,
related
particularly studies
allow
is
us to come up
brand
with
new.
a
That's
different
what I was doing
kind
on
of
Sunday.
grouping principle? I mean, you're absolutely
So,
right. And
that is
when I say that
absolutely the next
that
step,
finite mixture analysis brought to
that
literary
I'm
studies
hoping
is
will
brand
bear
new. That's
fruit.
what I was doing on Sunday.
but its
so
usage here, I think,
that
at
is
least let's just
absolutely
say
the
that-
next step.
that some
that
labels
I'm hoping
are
will
more
bear fruit.
contiguous and more
but
descriptive
but its usage
of certain
here,
kinds of things.
I think, at least lets us say that some labels are more contiguous
Thank you so much.
and more descriptive of certain kinds of things than others. Thank you so much.